Stop being a prisoner of your own mind. Most people do not realize how much of their suffering is self-generated. They believe the world is pressing down on them, when in fact the greater pressure often comes from the mind's automatic habit of turning events into emotional verdicts. A sharp comment from another person, a delay in plans, an unexpected loss, a difficult workplace, a sudden change in circumstances, these things are treated as if they are the direct creators of pain. But the event itself is not the whole problem. What follows it is. The mind receives something, interprets it, and then reacts so quickly that the whole sequence feels like one unavoidable motion. That feeling of inevitability is deceptive. The real trap is not the event. It is the unconscious story built around the event. A phrase is heard and instantly becomes disrespect. A setback appears and instantly becomes failure. Uncertainty shows itself and instantly becomes danger. The nervous system is no longer responding to reality so much as to the meaning assigned to reality. In that sense, a person can become a prisoner without any visible walls. They are not being physically restrained. They are being led by their own unexamined interpretations, which rise so fast and so automatically that they seem natural. This is one of the deepest forms of bondage. If your peace depends entirely on how others behave, what others think, or whether life unfolds according to plan, then your inner state has already been outsourced. You are no longer governing your own experience. You are waiting for the world to behave kindly enough to let you feel stable. But the world has never agreed to such an arrangement. It changes constantly. People are inconsistent. Outcomes are uncertain. If your center can only survive under perfect conditions, then your center is not really a center at all. It is a temporary arrangement held together by luck. Buddhist teaching sees this clearly. It does not say that harsh words, difficult people, or unstable circumstances are imaginary. It says that the suffering attached to them is constructed. This distinction matters. A difficult event may appear, but the immediate emotional collapse that follows is not forced by the event itself. There is a space, however small, between what happens and what the mind makes of it. That space is where freedom begins. Most people never learn to notice that space because they move too quickly through it. The stimulus arrives, interpretation forms, reaction erupts, and by the time awareness catches up, the body is already flooded. This speed is what makes the process feel unbreakable. It happens so fast that the person mistakes habit for fate. But a habit, even a very deep one, is still a habit. And what is habitual can be trained. The work, then, is not to eliminate every difficult event. That is impossible. The work is to interrupt the automatic chain, to see the first impulse before it becomes a command, to refuse the immediate assumption that what you feel is the same thing as what is true. That refusal is not denial. It is intelligence. When the mind learns this, the whole structure of suffering begins to change. The outer world may remain unpredictable, but its power to define the inner world begins to weaken. You are no longer simply being acted upon. You are learning to observe the process by which you are acted upon. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. This is why silence matters so much. In a culture that worships instant response, silence can feel almost rebellious. People are trained to answer quickly, explain quickly, defend quickly, and share quickly. The moment a feeling appears, they are encouraged to express it. The moment a thought arises, they are encouraged to post it, say it, argue it, or broadcast it. Noise has become a kind of social proof. If you are not reacting, it is easy for others to assume you are absent. Yet what appears as presence is often just uncontrolled leakage. Silence interrupts that leakage. When the screens are removed, when the constant stream of opinions is turned off, when the mind is no longer fed a steady diet of distraction, something uncomfortable often emerges. The person meets the untrained mind. That encounter can feel unbearable at first, because the inner atmosphere is not as organized as the outer performance suggested. There may be criticism, anxiety, restlessness, anger, envy, or fear sitting quietly in the background. Many people flee from that discovery immediately by reaching for stimulation again. They turn the volume back up so they do not have to hear themselves. But the refusal to sit with silence is exactly what keeps the mind weak. A mind that cannot endure stillness has not yet learned self-command. It depends on movement to avoid contact with its own interior. It prefers sound to awareness. It prefers distraction to observation. Yet true strength begins when the person stops treating silence as emptiness and starts treating it as a form of clarity. Silence reveals what the noise had concealed. It exposes the patterns that run the nervous system. It shows which reactions are reflexive and which responses are actually chosen. That is why silence is not passive. It is active observation. When provoked, the reactive person immediately reveals where the pressure points are. Their irritation, fear, or defensiveness becomes visible at once. But the composed person does something more useful. They watch, they note, they witness the rise of the disturbance without being captured by it. The insult is not absorbed as truth. The anxiety is not treated as instruction. The emotion is not buried either. It is allowed to appear, but it is not given authority. That distinction between repression and silence is crucial. Repression hides the emotion and pushes it underground, where it continues to distort the mind. Silence does the opposite. It lets the wave rise fully while refusing to add fuel. The emotion crests and falls. The person remains intact. In that way, silence becomes a training ground for freedom. This form of discipline is not about becoming cold or mechanical. It is about learning not to hand your energy over to every disturbance. If reaction is the fire, silence is the oxygen withheld. Without constant reinforcement, the pattern weakens. What once controlled the body begins to lose its grip. And once that grip loosens, the possibility of a different way of living appears. Detachment is the next step, and it is often misunderstood. Many people confuse detachment with indifference, as though to care less were the same as to care wisely. They imagine the detached person as emotionally flat, detached from life, uninterested in outcomes, or untouched by human connection. But that is not detachment, that is absence. Real detachment is not the absence of feeling, it is the absence of bondage. A detached person can love deeply, work diligently, and engage fully without turning outcomes into a measure of self-worth. This is what gives detachment its strength. It allows a person to enter life with commitment while remaining free from the brittleness that comes from clinging. When someone is attached, they become fragile. They fear rejection because their sense of self depends on being approved. They fear failure because they have made success into identity. They fear change because they have tied peace to familiarity. The attached mind is always negotiating for safety. The detached mind sees more clearly. It knows that value does not disappear when circumstances shift. It knows that worth does not rise and fall like public opinion. It knows that the person who depends on applause is always one silence away from collapse. So instead of clinging, it participates. Instead of grasping, it offers. Instead of trying to control every outcome, it does the work and allows life to respond as it will. This is a profound kind of self-respect. It refuses to make emotional survival dependent on external control. It says, I will act with excellence, but I will not become owned by the results. I will care, but I will not strangle what I care about with fear. I will be present, but I will not reduce myself to the outcome of every encounter. That is what makes detachment protective rather than cold. Buddhist wisdom has long pointed to this as a release from suffering. To cling is to suffer because clinging demands that life stay still. But life does not stay still. It moves, shifts, breaks, grows, and dissolves. The person who knows this can love without panic. They can strive without desperation. They can face uncertainty without making uncertainty into a threat against their being. In that way, detachment is not withdrawal from life. It is the ability to remain steady inside it. This matters because so much of human distress comes from identifying too closely with the fuel of emotion. The moment a person believes anger is their authority, fear is their guide, and approval is their oxygen, they become manipulable by every passing condition. The antidote is not numbness, it is clarity. The mind learns to observe thought and emotion as whether real enough to notice, but not authoritative enough to obey blindly. That change is the beginning of sovereignty. The architecture of reactive living is built early and reinforced often. A child learns which expressions earn attention, which emotions provoke response, and which behaviors help them stay safe in the presence of others. Over time, these lessons become automatic. The body learns to tighten before the mind has time to interpret. The mind learns to assume threat before evidence is gathered. The self becomes organized around defense, approval, and anticipation. By adulthood, These patterns can feel less like habits and more like identity. That is why the first task is to understand the structure of the reaction itself. The process is usually simple. Something happens, the nervous system lights up, the mind assigns meaning, the body prepares to respond. But because this sequence happens quickly, people mistake it for truth rather than conditioning. They believe their anger is caused by the insult, their anxiety is caused by the future, and their shame is caused by the criticism. In reality, those external events are only part of the picture. What matters more is the internal machinery that has been trained to interpret them in a certain way. This machinery can be examined. The work begins by noticing repetition. What kinds of people trigger you most? What kinds of words? What kinds of silences? What situations always produce the same tightening, the same defensiveness, the same urge to attack, withdraw, or please? These are not random emotional accidents. They are maps. They reveal where the mind has been trained to misread the world as danger or judgment. Buddhism, at its core, asks for this kind of radical observation. Not self-hatred, not shame. Observation, the point is to see that the reaction is not the self. The reaction is a pattern, and a pattern can be understood, interrupted, and eventually weakened. That understanding alone can be liberating, because it removes the aura of inevitability from emotional life. If every reaction is treated as fate, then no change is possible. But if reaction is treated as a learned sequence, then the possibility of training appears. You are not cursed to remain the same. You are conditioned, and conditioning can be changed. This is the hidden dignity of self-observation. It allows the person to stop identifying with every surge of emotion, as if it were a command from the deepest truth. Instead, they begin to see that much of what has been called personality is really just habit under pressure. And once habit is seen clearly, it loses some of its power. The physics of the pause is where freedom becomes practical. A pause is not a dramatic event. It is a tiny interruption, often so small that others do not notice it. But in that small interruption lies the difference between being dragged by life and meeting life consciously. The gap between stimulus and response does not have to be large to matter. It only has to exist. That gap can be cultivated. At first, the pause may feel unnatural. The mind wants to leap immediately from feeling to action, from insult to defense, from fear to prediction, from irritation to speech. That immediacy is part of what makes the old pattern so convincing. But when the person begins to slow the sequence down even slightly, they can witness how much power is lost to haste. The body floods, the story forms, the response follows. If there is no pause, the entire pattern repeats itself as though nothing else were possible. But if there is a pause, something else can enter. Breath is one of the simplest ways to create that space. A deliberate inhale, a slower exhale, a moment of physical grounding. These are not mystical acts. They are practical interruptions. They remind the body that it is not being hunted by every passing thought. They give the nervous system a chance to settle before interpretation hardens into belief. In that settlement, the person can remember that emotion is information, not law. Cognitive distancing helps as well. Instead of saying, "I am furious," the person begins to notice anger is present. Instead of "I am under attack," they observe the body is interpreting this as attack. That small shift in language creates a larger shift in experience. The self is no longer fused with the reaction. The reaction becomes something observed rather than obeyed. This does not weaken the person. It strengthens them because it returns choice. The pause is therefore not hesitation in the fearful sense. It is precision. It is the refusal to let speed masquerade as truth. It is the willingness to wait long enough for awareness to join the event before the event becomes identity. That willingness is rare, which is why it is powerful over time. The pause becomes less effortful. The mind begins to recognize that it is safe to observe before acting. The body learns that silence does not equal collapse. The nervous system becomes less addicted to immediate release. What once felt like provocation begins to look more like data. And data can be used. It does not have to be worshipped. That is the physics of freedom. The momentary stop in which automatic slavery loses momentum. The pause does something even more important than interrupting a reaction. It reintroduces authorship. In automatic living, the self behaves like a passenger inside its own body, pulled forward by reflex, memory, and fear. But once the gap appears, even briefly, the person is no longer only a receiver, they become a participant. That distinction is the beginning of power. This is why silence is not merely the absence of sound. It is a disciplined environment in which the mind can meet itself without being immediately carried away. In silence, the hidden habits become audible. The need to explain, the urge to defend, the panic of being misunderstood, the compulsive wish to answer, the fear of looking weak, all of this rises when noise falls away. Many people experience that exposure and quickly return to stimulation, because the undisciplined mind often prefers distraction to honesty. Yet it is precisely this honesty that makes strength possible. A mind that cannot remain in silence is a mind that has not yet learned the difference between feeling and command. It hears a thought and obeys it. It feels an emotion and amplifies it. It is too quick to turn inner weather into outer action. Silence corrects this by slowing the inner machinery enough for discernment to appear. What is truly necessary? What is merely reactive? What deserves speech? And what deserves restraint? These questions become visible only when the noise of compulsion has been reduced. There is also a deeper form of silence that matters here. The silence of not feeding every emotional spark. Reactions survive because they are repeatedly rewarded. Anger receives speech, fear receives prediction, hurt receives narration, embarrassment receives self-attack. When the person stops giving these reactions continuous reinforcement, they lose intensity. They still appear, but they no longer dominate with the same force. The emotion is allowed to peak and pass like weather, rather than being converted into identity. This is where silence becomes intellectual warfare in the best sense. Not warfare against other people, but against the habit of being controlled by whatever appears first in the mind. The person learns to watch thought the way one watches clouds move across a sky. The cloud is real, but it is not the sky. Likewise, a passing fear or insult is real, but it is not the full truth of the self. Once this distinction is felt, the person becomes harder to manipulate by others, by circumstance, and by the mind's own old training. The result is not coldness, it is composure. And composure is far more powerful than emotional volatility, because composure does not surrender its center to every disturbance. It remains available, clear, and difficult to shake. The myth of being sensitive begins to weaken at this point. Many cultures praise sensitivity as though emotional volatility itself were a sign of depth. But sensitivity, when untrained, is often just porousness. The person feels everything and therefore governs nothing. They are easily moved, easily wounded, easily flattered, easily provoked. Their nervous system becomes an open door through which any disturbance may enter. That is not discernment, it is exposure. True sensitivity is different. It is the ability to perceive finely without being ruled by what is perceived. It notices nuance, it detects tone, it recognizes complexity, but it does not mistake every signal for a command. It receives information without becoming consumed by it. This is why emotional refinement is more valuable than emotional intensity. Intensity can look impressive while producing little wisdom. Refinement can look quiet while producing great accuracy. When a person becomes less reactive, their sensitivity does not disappear, it matures. They become able to tell the difference between a passing irritation and an important warning, between a genuine boundary violation and an ego bruise, between a real threat and a projected one. That distinction is essential because not all discomfort is meaningful, and not all peace is truthful. Discernment is needed to separate signal from noise. The untrained mind treats every discomfort as if it deserves equal treatment. The trained mind does not. It asks what this feeling is actually telling me, and whether the response I am about to make is proportional to reality. This is one of the clearest marks of maturity. The person no longer worships feeling as authority. They respect it as information, then test it against clarity. Buddhist teaching supports this because it consistently returns to mindfulness, not as a buzzword, but as a method of seeing. When thought and emotion are observed instead of obeyed, they reveal their patterns. Some are useful, some are habitual, some are inherited, some are exaggerated by fear. The person who learns this becomes less vulnerable to cultural romanticism around emotional chaos. They see that a calmer nervous system is not a lack of depth. It is often the condition that allows depth to become useful. That insight changes self-respect as well. The person stops mistaking reactivity for authenticity. They stop believing that every strong emotion must be expressed immediately to be real. They learn that restraint can be more honest than discharge. A thoughtful response is not a lesser response. A delayed response is not a weaker one. Often the most accurate response appears only after the immediate storm has passed. This is why the myth of being sensitive must be challenged. The goal is not to feel less. The goal is to feel clearly enough that emotion no longer controls the quality of your life. Detached participation is the form that this clarity takes in the world. A common mistake is to imagine that detachment means stepping away from life, refusing to care, or remaining emotionally unavailable. But the strongest people are rarely those who withdraw from everything. They are those who participate fully, while remaining free from the need to own the outcome. They work intensely, love sincerely, and strive honestly, yet they do not collapse when reality refuses to match their preferred script. This distinction matters because attachment makes participation brittle. If I need you to respond a certain way for me to feel safe, then my engagement with you is already compromised. If I need the project to succeed in exactly the form I imagined, then my effort is vulnerable to panic. If I need life to validate my self-image at every turn, then even good events can become anxious ones. Attachment is not love, it is dependence disguised as meaning. Detachment restores dignity. It says that your worth is not a stock price being updated by every opinion around you. Your value does not rise because someone approves of you, and it does not collapse because someone misunderstands you. This does not make praise meaningless or criticism useless. It simply places them in proportion. They are data, not verdicts. They may inform, but they do not define. When a person participates from this place, they become harder to destabilize. They can take risks without becoming desperate. They can serve without becoming resentful. They can pursue excellence without demanding guarantee. They can love without clenching. This is a freer kind of action because it is no longer driven by the panic of self-preservation. It is rooted in clarity, and clarity is sturdier than appetite. Buddhism would say, this is one of the great releases available to the human mind. The person who no longer clings can finally engage reality as it is rather than as the ego wishes it to be. That is not passivity. It is strength without compulsion. It is action without inner slavery. It is the ability to walk through uncertainty without being shattered by it because the self is no longer pretending that certainty is owed. The more deeply this is lived, the less the outside world can manipulate the inside world. Events still happen. People still speak. Pressure still comes. But none of these things can easily take the wheel. The person has learned to remain in motion without surrendering the center from which motion is guided. That is the mature form of participation, present, engaged, and free. To understand why this state is so powerful, it helps to look more closely at how the reactive ego is built. The ego is not simply vanity or pride. It is the organizing structure that tries to keep the self safe by reading every environment as a possible threat to its image. It asks, how am I seen? Am I respected? Am I losing ground? Am I being dismissed? Am I still in control? These questions can run beneath consciousness for years, shaping behavior without ever fully entering speech. Because of this, the ego becomes easily triggered. A tone of voice, a delay in response, a minor criticism, a comparison, a perceived slight each can activate the older survival story. The body tightens, the mind accelerates, interpretation rushes in before evidence has been fully considered. This is why the person feels possessed by reaction. The reaction is not random. It is a rehearsed defense strategy. The first step in disarming that strategy is recognition. What pattern does this reaction belong to? When did the body first learn to respond this way? What is the emotional reward of the reaction? What does it protect you from feeling beneath the surface? These are not questions of blame, they are questions of mapping. To map the trigger is to make it less mystical. Once the trigger is named, it is no longer an invisible power. It becomes something that can be studied. That study often reveals how much of reaction is about identity maintenance. The person is not only upset by what happened, they are upset by what it might imply about who they are. This is why the mind reacts so quickly. The issue is never just the event. It is the status of the self under pressure. If that self feels fragile, almost anything can become a threat. Buddhist practice weakens this fragility by repeatedly returning the mind to direct observation, not story, not image. Observation, the person learns to say, in effect, "This is appearing," rather than "this is me." That shift may seem small, but it is revolutionary. It creates distance without denial, clarity without coldness, and responsibility without panic. As that distance grows, the ego loses some of its power to script every moment. The person stills, but they are no longer governed by the need to defend an image at every turn. That is the foundation of emotional sovereignty. Emotional sovereignty is the condition in which the inner life is no longer governed by the loudest stimulus in the room. The person does not become unfeeling. They become less governable by impulse. They can stand in conflict without dissolving into it. They can hear criticism without collapsing into self-contempt. They can receive praise without inflating into delusion. They can feel fear without turning fear into prophecy. This is a very different kind of strength from the one that depends on dominating others. Power, in the common sense, is often associated with force, visibility, or control. But the most composed person in the room often has the greatest influence because they are not leaking energy into reaction. They are not easy to bait. They are not easy to rush. They do not need to dominate the atmosphere in order to remain steady within it. That steadiness becomes a kind of authority precisely because it is rare. The person who has achieved some measure of emotional sovereignty no longer confuses urgency with importance. They do not answer every pressure immediately. They do not confuse every opinion with a command. They hold their center long enough to see what is actually happening. This creates a powerful kind of social presence. Others sense that they cannot be pushed around by noise. Such people are often listened to more carefully because they have learned to listen first. This is not about becoming passive or withdrawn. It is about becoming internally organized. A sovereign mind knows what deserves attention and what deserves restraint. It can be generous without being porous, firm without being rigid, engaged without being captured. That balance is difficult to fake because it arises from deep internal work. It is the result of repeatedly choosing not to surrender the self to every passing disturbance. Buddhism would say that this kind of stability is not a luxury. It is a liberation. The person who does not need to be ruled by emotional weather becomes available to life in a new way. They can think more clearly, act more precisely, and relate more honestly. The world is not less complex, but the mind is less chaotic. That reduction in inner chaos is what makes influence possible without coercion. The sovereign person does not need to prove power. Power becomes visible in how little they need to react. The more stable the center, the less the person is moved by the edge. And the less they are moved by the edge, the more firmly their life belongs to them. Stillness is the great filter that reveals what is real and what is merely reactive noise. When the mind stops rushing to explain, defend, or interpret every moment, it begins to see life with far less distortion. The event is no longer fused with the story. The story is no longer mistaken for truth. The person can finally notice how much of what they once called certainty was only speed. This matters because reaction often feels like clarity when it is actually confusion wearing urgency. The heated mind believes it sees everything at once, but in truth it is only seeing through its own agitation. Stillness interrupts that illusion. It slows the internal weather enough for patterns to become visible. A slight delay, a deliberate breath, a refusal to answer immediately, these are not weaknesses. They are methods of seeing more accurately. In stillness, the mind also becomes less obedient to bias. The ego prefers evidence that confirms its fears, its pride, and its old self-image. It selects, it exaggerates, it forgets context. But when the person learns to remain still, even for a moment, there is space to notice how quickly the mind tries to turn sensation into story. That noticing is powerful, because once bias is seen, it loses some of its authority. The person then begins to understand that truth does not always arrive loudly. In fact, truth is often quieter than the reaction that follows an event. It appears in the pause, in the unclenched breath, in the second thought that comes after the first emotional wave has already started to fall. Stillness allows that second thought to emerge, and that second thought is frequently wiser, less defensive, and more closely aligned with reality. This is why stillness is not withdrawal from life. It is access to life without distortion. The person is not less engaged because they are still. They are more able to engage well because they are no longer being dragged by every internal impulse. Stillness gives the mind a chance to separate signal from noise. That separation is one of the highest forms of discipline. It is how the inner center is preserved. The unmovable center is not a fantasy of perfect composure. It is the cultivated ability to remain anchored even while pressure rises. Life will continue to apply force. Conversations will become difficult. Plans will unravel. Expectations will fail. People will misunderstand. The body will sometimes tire. The world will not stop testing the mind. The question is not whether pressure will come. The question is whether the pressure will be allowed to own the center. A person with an unmovable center does not become emotionless. They become less easily displaced. They can feel the heat of conflict without surrendering their judgment to it. They can face uncertainty without making uncertainty into panic. They can withstand criticism without collapsing into self-erasure. They are still affected, but they are not easily conquered. This ability is built through repeated practice, not one grand revelation. The pause must be used again and again. The silence must be endured again and again. The emotional storm must be witnessed again and again without feeding it with extra drama. Every repetition strengthens the center. Over time, what once felt fragile becomes reliable. The person learns that their stability does not have to depend on favorable surroundings. That is a profound shift, because it removes the world from the role of inner landlord. The person no longer rents peace from external conditions. They generate it through disciplined attention, clear observation, and refusal to hand over the self too quickly. In that sense, the center becomes unmovable, not because it blocks everything, but because it no longer mistakes motion for danger. Buddhism points directly to this kind of equilibrium. The calm mind is not a mind with no waves. It is a mind that knows waves are not the whole ocean. That awareness changes the way difficulty is met. Instead of being swallowed by each surge, the person watches it rise and pass. Instead of panicking at every disturbance, they stay with the deeper continuity that remains underneath. This is what makes the center unmovable, not rigidity, not denial, continuity. And once continuity is established, the final integration becomes possible. The unreactive state stops being a technique and becomes a way of being. The final integration happens when the pause is no longer a conscious trick, but the default shape of the mind. At first, stillness must be practiced deliberately. The person must remember to breathe, to watch, to wait, to avoid immediate reaction. But over time, the repeated choice not to be governed by impulse creates a new baseline. The old automatic slavery weakens. The system changes. What once required effort begins to feel natural. This is the point at which freedom becomes durable. A reactive person is constantly being pulled outward by the world. A sovereign person remains in contact with the world without losing themselves in it. They can act, but they do not have to be owned by action. They can feel, but they do not have to become the feeling. They can be challenged, but they do not have to collapse into challenge. This is what it means for unreactivity to become permanent enough to serve as a life foundation. The transformation does not mean that emotions vanish or that the person becomes detached from human life in a sterile way. It means the person is no longer giving away their center for free. They can be present without being programmable. They can participate without being captured. They can love without being brittle. They can endure without self-abandonment. That is why this state is not emptiness. It is freedom with shape. When this integration is real, the person no longer experiences stillness as something special they must enter. It becomes part of how they operate. The reaction still appears sometimes, but it does not rule. The pause appears first more often than before. The witness is stronger than the impulse. The center is more stable than the edge. Over time, that arrangement becomes the person's normal life. That normal life is much quieter than the one built on constant internal battle. It does not need to announce its strength. It simply shows itself in the way the person handles pressure, criticism, uncertainty, and change. Others may still be volatile around them. Circumstances may still fluctuate, but the inner government has changed hands. The person now belongs more fully to themselves. This is the final integration, not perfection. but a settled authority over one's own interior world. Not a life without disturbance, but a life no longer ruled by disturbance. And that, in the end, is the real end of automatic slavery. To begin again is to admit that the mind has not yet exhausted its resistance. There is still a part that wants control, another part that wants certainty, and another that would rather be offended than unclear. This is not failure. It is simply the structure of being human before discipline has fully become identity. The work, then, is not to pretend those inner currents do not exist. The work is to meet them without being recruited by them. A beginning is often misunderstood because people expect it to feel dramatic. They expect a revelation, a surge, a clean break from the old self. But real beginnings are usually quieter. They start in the small decision not to answer too fast, not to defend too quickly, not to let the first emotional wave dictate the whole day. A beginning is rarely one event. It is a repeated refusal to remain unconscious. This is why the path feels slow. The deeper habits of reaction were not built in a moment, and they will not dissolve in one either. A person may read an insight and feel changed for an hour, but the body remembers old reflexes. The nervous system returns to its familiar roots. The ego resumes its old alarms. So the true beginning is not the first moment of inspiration. It is the first moment of practice after inspiration has faded. That is where the life actually changes. The old self thrives on speed because speed prevents examination. If the reaction is immediate, the person never has to ask whether the reaction is true. If the defense is instant, it never has to justify itself. If the insult is answered without pause, the wound never has to reveal its shape. Beginning again means interrupting this acceleration. It means allowing time to enter the space where habit used to rule without question. When time enters, choice appears. Choice is what makes a human life more than a chain of reflexes. The person can still feel the pull of anger, fear, pride, or shame. But now those forces are seen as invitations rather than orders. They may be powerful, but they are not sovereign unless the person hands over sovereignty. This is the subtle revolution of disciplined attention. The mind starts to see that its strongest impulses are not the same thing as its deepest truth. At first, this can feel almost unnatural. The person is used to obeying the first signal. Silence may feel awkward. Waiting may feel weak. Not reacting may feel like surrender. But with repetition, the opposite becomes clear. The pause is not retreat. It is the point at which the self stops being dragged and begins to lead. Once that is understood, beginning again no longer feels like defeat. It feels like reclaiming authority. The remarkable thing about a true beginning is that it does not ask permission from the old identity. The old identity may protest. It may insist that the person has always been this way, that the pattern is permanent, that change is for others. But a beginning does not wait for the old self to approve. It proceeds anyway, quietly and steadily, until a new pattern of being becomes more familiar than the old one. That is the hidden promise of the path. Not escape from humanity, but freedom from unconscious repetition. Freedom from repetition is one of the rarest experiences a person can have, because most of life is spent replaying what has not yet been understood. The same wounds seek the same confirmations. The same insecurities produce the same behaviors. The same unexamined stories recruit the same emotional reactions. A person may believe they are choosing, while in fact they are circling a familiar wound with great sophistication. The circle feels like identity because it has been repeated so often. To break that circle, the person must become willing to see the pattern without flattering it. This is difficult because patterns are not only painful, they are also familiar, and familiarity is seductive. Even suffering can feel safe when it is known. The mind would rather repeat a recognizable misery than risk the disorientation of transformation. That is why people often defend the very habits that keep them trapped. Those habits have become part of the architecture of self. Still, if the pattern is seen clearly enough, its authority begins to weaken. The person realizes that the reaction is not inevitable, it is learned. The fear is not a prophecy, it is a memory. The anger is not proof of righteousness, it may be protection. The shame is not a fact about the self, it may be an old sentence still echoing in the nervous system. Once this is understood, the person can begin to separate reality from conditioning. That separation is essential because freedom does not begin with force. It begins with seeing. The person must recognize what is happening before they can stop identifying with it. And recognition often arrives in the most ordinary places. A difficult conversation, a delayed reply, a moment of jealousy, a sudden defensiveness, the familiar tightening of the chest. These are not minor incidents. They are the exact moments where the machinery of unconsciousness becomes visible. The mistake is to think that spirituality or maturity means never being triggered. It does not. It means using the trigger as information rather than as a command. The trigger shows where the old wiring is still active. It reveals where attention has not yet become stable. It offers a map of the remaining work. In that sense, disturbance is not an enemy of growth. It is often the doorway to it. If the person can remain present long enough to observe rather than obey, the circle loosens. The old pattern loses some of its hypnotic force. What once felt like destiny begins to look like repetition, and what once felt impossible to change begins to feel merely practiced. That realization is profoundly liberating because what is practiced can be replaced. And once replacement begins, a new kind of inner life becomes possible. A new inner life is not built by grand declarations. It is built by tiny, repeated acts of non-collaboration with confusion. The person notices the surge and does not feed it. They feel the urge and do not immediately obey it. They hear the story and do not treat it as sacred. This may sound small, but inner architecture changes the same way a river changes course. Not all at once, but by persistent redirection. In the beginning, the change may be almost invisible to others. The person still looks like themselves. They still speak with the same voice, walk through the same rooms, and face the same pressures. But internally, something important has shifted. There is a small space where there used to be only collision. There is a pause where there used to be automatic fusion. There is a witness where there used to be only reaction. This interior space is the seed of real strength. Strength is often misunderstood as hardness. People imagine the strong person as someone who does not bend, does not feel, does not yield, but that image is brittle. Real strength is closer to flexibility under pressure. It can absorb strain without fracturing because it is not built on denial. It sees clearly, and because it sees clearly, it can respond proportionally. It does not waste itself fighting shadows. This is why discipline matters so much. Discipline is not punishment. It is the repeated training of attention, so that the mind can stop surrendering itself to every passing disturbance. A disciplined person is not one who has eliminated inner movement. They are one who has learned to remain seated at the center of that movement. That is a form of dignity, and dignity is one of the least noisy forms of power. The new inner life also changes how the person treats time. Reaction lives in the instant. Discipline creates duration. It introduces the possibility that the best response may come later, after the first emotional weather has passed. This changes not only behavior, but identity. The person stops seeing themselves as someone who must immediately discharge what they feel. They become someone who can hold feeling without being consumed by it. That holding capacity is one of the great hidden capacities of the mature mind. It allows grief to be grieved, anger to be understood, fear to be examined, and joy to be received without greed. Nothing is flattened. Everything is made more usable by being seen without panic. This is how the inner life becomes new, not by suppressing what arises, but by refusing to be ruled by it. What emerges from this refusal is a cleaner relationship to reality. The person no longer needs reality to flatter the ego in order to accept it. They can face disappointment without immediately turning it into humiliation. They can face success without instantly becoming inflated. They can face contradiction without collapsing into self-protection. Reality becomes something to meet, not something to manipulate. This is a major shift because many people spend their lives negotiating with reality, as if it were an enemy that must be controlled. They want the world to confirm them, protect them, and arrange itself around their preferences. When it does not, they feel violated. But the more the mind is trained, the less it demands this impossible arrangement. It learns that peace comes from relationship to truth, not from possession of conditions. This does not make life easier in the shallow sense. It makes life truer, and truth is often demanding before it is liberating. It requires the person to admit how much energy was spent trying to secure an identity. It requires honesty about the emotional bargains the ego has been making for years. It requires patience with the fact that the old self will not disappear politely. It resists being dethroned. Yet the person who continues learns something essential. Reality is not fragile. The self was the fragile one. The more accurately reality is seen, the less terrifying it becomes. This is because much of suffering comes not from what is happening, but from the mind's insistence on adding unnecessary resistance. The event hurts. The story multiplies the hurt. The reaction chains the person to the hurt. When the story loosens, the pain is still real, but it no longer owns the entire field. That is why truth can feel like relief even when it is uncomfortable. It removes the burden of maintaining illusion. And once illusion is no longer the primary strategy, the person gains access to a quieter intelligence. Quieter intelligence is the kind that does not need to announce itself. It does not rush to dominate a room with opinions. It does not confuse volume with insight. It listens longer, sees deeper, and speaks only after contact with what is actually present. This kind of intelligence is especially dangerous to illusion, because illusion depends on haste. It survives in the gap between appearance and examination. The reactive mind hates quiet intelligence, because quiet intelligence is patient enough to see through its disguises. It notices when an opinion is really a defense. It recognizes when certainty is just fear in formal clothing. It can tell when a person is performing strength rather than embodying it. Because it is less impressed by spectacle, it is harder to deceive. And because it is harder to deceive, it is also harder to manipulate. This is one reason why inner work has social consequences. The person who is less reactive becomes less available to control. They cannot be baited as easily. They are less dependent on approval. They do not panic as quickly when challenged. They ask better questions. They do not need every interaction to validate their position. Their freedom makes them less predictable in the best sense. But quieter intelligence is not cynical. Cynicism is simply disappointment hardened into posture. Quiet intelligence is warmer than cynicism because it does not need to insult what it sees. It can recognize delusion without becoming consumed by contempt. It can see weakness without losing compassion. It can be exact without being cruel. That balance is rare and deeply stabilizing. The person who develops it becomes a different kind of presence. Their words carry more weight because they are not trying to carry too much. Their silences matter because they are not empty. Their reactions are measured because they are not outsourced to impulse. Even their mistakes become more instructive because they are not hidden beneath ego theater. This is the paradox of clarity. The more clearly a person sees, the less they need to prove that they see. And when proof becomes less important than understanding, the person steps closer to freedom. Freedom, in this context, is not the ability to do whatever impulse suggests. That is merely license, and license often leads back to bondage. Real freedom is the capacity not to be compelled by every internal or external pressure. It is the ability to stay present with discomfort without immediately escaping into reaction. It is the power to choose response over reflex, truth over habit, and patience over panic. This form of freedom has consequences. It changes how the person relates to conflict, because conflict no longer has to become self-threat. It changes how they relate to desire, because desire no longer has to become command. It changes how they relate to loss, because loss no longer has to become annihilation. The world still carries weight, but the person no longer mistakes weight for captivity. At this stage, the unreactive life begins to show its ethical dimension. When a person is less ruled by fear and ego, they are less likely to wound others in order to protect themselves. They become more reliable, less manipulative, less defensive, and more capable of genuine care. Their stillness is not only inward, it improves the quality of their relationships. They are less likely to turn every disagreement into a referendum on worth. This matters because many forms of harm begin in reactivity. Someone speaks sharply because they felt diminished. Someone lies because they feared exposure. Someone dominates because they feared vulnerability. Someone withdraws because they feared rejection. In each case, the behavior is an attempt to reduce inner discomfort, but it often creates outer damage. Freedom from reactivity interrupts that chain. The person who is no longer compelled by every discomfort becomes safer to be around. They do not need others to carry the burden of their unresolved states. They can sit with uncertainty without exporting panic. They can listen without preparing a counterattack. They can disagree without needing to humiliate. These are not minor virtues. They are the basis of mature human contact. And beneath all of it is the same quiet realization. The self becomes freer as it becomes less theatrical. The theatrical self is always trying to secure an audience, even if that audience is internal. It rehearses, performs, defends, and revises itself in the hope of avoiding shame and winning significance. But a life built on performance is exhausting because it must be continually maintained. The moment the applause stops, or the expected response fails to arrive, the self feels endangered. That is not freedom. It is dependence dressed as identity. The unreactive life slowly ends this performance. The person no longer needs every thought to be impressive, every emotion to be expressed, or every moment to be seen. They are less interested in appearing coherent than in becoming coherent. That distinction is crucial. Appearance can be managed. Coherence must be lived. One can sound wise while remaining inwardly scattered. One can appear controlled while still being ruled by invisible compulsions. The work is to close that gap. As the gap closes, the person becomes more trustworthy to themselves. They do not need to promise grand transformations because the transformation is already happening in ordinary moments. A cleaner response, a quieter tone, a delayed reaction, a clearer boundary, a smaller egoic demand. These are the signs that the inner theater is losing power. They may seem minor, but they accumulate into an entirely different life. That life is not characterized by dramatic transcendence. It is characterized by fewer unnecessary collisions with reality, less self-inflicted suffering, less reactive harm, more accurate action, more stable attention, more honest presence. In that sense, the end of automatic slavery is not the end of feeling or the end of struggle. It is the end of being ruled by what is unexamined. That is enough to change everything. At this point, the path no longer feels like a philosophical idea. It feels like a way of breathing, a way of meeting pressure, a way of inhabiting time. And once it becomes that, it is no longer something the person visits occasionally. It becomes the ground on which their life stands. What remains, after all the insights and disciplines, is the ordinary moment, the cup on the table, the message left unanswered, the criticism that still stings, the silence after a difficult conversation. This is where the work is tested, because the mind does not become free in theory. It becomes free in contact with the everyday. The grand language of transformation means little if the person still collapses at the smallest provocation. Ordinariness is difficult because it offers no ceremony. There is no dramatic music when you do not react. There is no visible medal when you let a feeling pass without feeding it. There is no audience when you choose clarity over impulse. Yet these are the moments that decide whether the transformation is real. The small, unseen decisions are the architecture of the self. Many people wait for a perfect emotional state before they act wisely. But wisdom rarely arrives as a perfect state. It arrives as the decision to remain steady while the state is imperfect. The person feels the pull of irritation and chooses restraint. They feel the desire to retaliate and choose proportion. They feel the urge to explain themselves and choose silence. These small refusals are not passive. They are active forms of authorship. The ordinary moment is also where humility becomes necessary. The mind likes to imagine that insight has already solved everything, but the body still remembers its old habits. The ego still seeks its familiar rewards. The nervous system still startles. So the person must begin again in the same places where they once failed. That repetition is not punishment. It is the shape of practice. There is something almost sacred in returning to the same challenge without resentment. The person is no longer asking life to stop presenting difficulty. They are asking themselves to remain present within it. That change in posture is enormous. It means the world no longer has to become easier for the person to become stronger. Strength is no longer dependent on convenience, and so the ordinary moment becomes the true arena of liberation. Not in abstraction, but in the exact place where the self is most tempted to forget itself. Forgetting oneself is one of the most common forms of suffering. A person does not need a catastrophe to lose the center. They can lose it in a glance, a tone, a delayed reply, a subtle disrespect, a comparison, a sudden memory. or a small embarrassment, the self is constantly being offered opportunities to abandon itself. Most of the time, that abandonment happens so quickly the person never notices it. They simply call the result having a bad day. But the more attentive the person becomes, the more these moments can be seen for what they are. Miniature tests of sovereignty. Will the self hand itself over to every passing disturbance, or will it remain intact long enough to respond with intelligence? This question sounds simple, but it reveals the whole battle. Inner freedom is not won once and for all. It is defended repeatedly in small invisible acts. That defense is not hardening, it is remembering. Remembering that the insult is not the whole of reality. Remembering that the feeling is not the final authority. Remembering that the first story the mind tells is often the least reliable. Remembering that dignity can survive discomfort. Remembering that presence is more powerful than panic. These reminders seem ordinary, but they are how the center is preserved. And because the center is preserved, the person becomes less dependent on drama for self-definition. They no longer need life to be constantly intense in order to feel alive. In fact, intensity can begin to seem suspicious when it appears too often. The person starts to notice how much agitation was once mistaken for depth. They begin to value steadiness not as dullness, but as a more reliable condition for understanding. This is a radical revaluation. A culture that idolizes reaction will always misunderstand composure. It will call calmness bland and volatility authentic. But volatility is often just an untrained nervous system seeking attention. Calmness, by contrast, can contain more honesty because it is less distorted by immediate self-defense. It is able to look directly. The person who can look directly does not need to dramatize life to justify their presence in it. They are already present. That is enough. And in that enoughness, something quietly profound takes root. The self no longer needs to fight for existence at every turn. When the self stops fighting for existence at every turn, attention becomes available for something larger than survival. The mind is no longer consumed by the task of defending its image, and so it can finally begin to see what was always there beneath the noise, the texture of life itself, not as concept but as immediate experience, breath, texture, tone, weather, relationship. Time, the world becomes less like a battlefield of personal meanings and more like a field of contact. This is a major shift because the reactive self is endlessly preoccupied with interpretation. It asks what everything means about me. The glance, the absence, the delay, the praise, the failure, the tension, all of it is translated into identity language. But when reactivity loosens, experience no longer has to become a referendum on the self. It can simply be experienced. That may sound small, but it is one of the deepest freedoms available to consciousness. To experience without immediate appropriation is liberating because it returns reality to itself. The person sees an event rather than a wound, a feeling rather than a verdict, a moment rather than a prophecy. This does not erase suffering, but it removes the extra suffering that comes from self-centered distortion. The pain is still pain, the loss is still loss, but neither is forced to carry the entire burden of self-meaning. At that point, attention begins to feel cleaner. It is less crowded by commentary. The mind is not constantly narrating its way through the day. Instead, it can rest in directness. And directness has its own quiet beauty. It makes the simple things vivid again. It also makes the difficult things more bearable, because they are no longer being multiplied by endless mental performance. The person may notice that they are more available to others too. When the inner room is less full of defensive noise, there is more space for real listening. The other person is not treated as a threat or a mirror, but as another presence. That change alters the quality of relationship profoundly. It becomes easier to love without tightening. This is why freedom from automatic slavery is never only private. It changes the way the self meets the world. It makes contact cleaner, less distorted, more humane. And when contact becomes cleaner, the heart becomes less guarded without becoming naive. A less guarded heart is not a foolish heart. It is a heart that no longer mistakes every vulnerability for danger. It knows the difference between openness and exposure, between trust and surrender, between tenderness and self-erasure. This distinction matters because many people close themselves not from wisdom, but from accumulated reaction. They were hurt, so they armored. They were misunderstood, so they hardened. They were disappointed, so they withdrew. Over time, protection becomes identity. But protection that never relaxes becomes its own prison. The person can no longer receive without suspicion, care without calculation, or intimacy without fear. Even good moments are filtered through the expectation of loss. That is a heavy way to live. The heart ends up guarding itself so aggressively that it cannot fully participate in what it was trying to preserve. The unreactive life changes this by making protection more intelligent. The person does not throw themselves into every current. They do not ignore boundaries. They do not confuse generosity with self-betrayal. But they also do not treat every possibility of pain as reason to shut down. They learn that a guarded heart may survive more, but it also lives less. A less guarded heart, by contrast, can risk reality without being governed by fear of it. This is where courage takes on a new meaning. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to remain open enough to tell the truth in the presence of fear. It is the decision not to let fear become the architect of the whole personality. That is a quieter courage than the one celebrated in stories, but it is more difficult and more enduring. As the heart softens intelligently, the person becomes more able to stay with complexity. They do not need every relationship to be simple. They can tolerate ambiguity without panic. They can hold affection and disappointment at the same time. They can love people without making them into ideals. They can forgive without pretending that harm did not happen. This capacity makes life more honest, not less. And honesty is one of the clearest signs that automatic slavery is ending. The person is no longer hiding from reality to preserve comfort. They are learning to live in a way that makes truth sustainable. Truth becomes sustainable when it is no longer treated as an occasional event, and instead becomes the atmosphere of the mind. The person does not need a dramatic moment of revelation to remain aligned. They return, again and again, to what is actually here. This returning is not glamorous, but it is transformative because it creates consistency. A life built on consistency is sturdier than one built on occasional insight. Consistency matters because the old patterns are also consistent. They return with impressive reliability. The ego does not disappear after one breakthrough. It tests, circles, and adapts. It finds new disguises. It turns pride into self-importance, insecurity into moral superiority, and fear into busyness. So the work continues. The person must keep recognizing the subtle ways reactivity tries to re-enter through side doors. This ongoing recognition is not exhausting in the same way constant reaction is exhausting. Reaction drains because it fragments the self. Recognition clarifies because it reunifies attention. The person is not split between stimulus and story as often. They are less likely to be carried away before they can even notice what happened. That small increase in awareness has enormous consequences over time. It changes memory too. The person begins to remember themselves not as a bundle of episodes, but as a process of becoming. They stop demanding instant perfection from a system that is still learning. That compassion matters. Harsh self-judgment can easily become another form of control, another emotional reaction pretending to be discipline. But real discipline is patient. It knows that the mind changes by repetition, not by shame. So truth becomes sustainable when the person is willing to stay with the process long enough for it to mature. This requires courage, patience, and a refusal to abandon the work simply because it is unglamorous. The reward is a kind of inner reliability that makes life less theatrical and more inhabitable. And once life becomes more inhabitable, the person can finally begin to trust their own presence. Trusting one's own presence means no longer needing to perform constantly in order to feel legitimate. The person can simply be where they are, doing what is in front of them, without the inner demand to justify every moment. This trust grows slowly because the reactive self is deeply suspicious of stillness. It worries that if it stops defending itself, something will be lost. But what is lost is only the exhausting burden of constant self-management. In its place comes a quieter confidence. The person does not need to inflate their importance, because they are no longer so frightened of insignificance. They do not need every interaction to confirm their value. They do not need every uncertainty to be solved immediately. They can remain present without demanding that presence prove itself. This is a subtle but profound liberation. Trusting presence also means accepting that clarity can be partial and still useful. The mind often wants total certainty before it moves, but life rarely offers that. A person rooted in presence can act without overexposure to doubt. They do not need perfect conditions to remain aligned. They can take one true step, then another, without pretending the entire path is visible. This makes them less brittle and more capable. At this stage, the person begins to realize that the most stable parts of life are not built from intensity, but from repeated alignment. A daily return to clarity, a repeated willingness to pause, a refusal to make every mood into an identity, a commitment to see what is actually happening. These practices build a deeper trust than any momentary inspiration can provide. And with trust comes a more spacious relationship to the self. The self is no longer a project under emergency management. It becomes a living process worthy of care but not panic. The person can work on themselves without hating themselves. They can improve without self-contempt. They can remain unfinished without despair. That is an extraordinary place to stand. It is also the place where the end of automatic slavery stops being a goal and becomes a lived reality. When automatic slavery ends, it does not end with applause. It ends with ordinary fidelity. The person keeps returning to what is real, keeps noticing the first stirrings of reactivity, and keeps choosing not to hand over the center. There is no final ceremony for this. The transformation is confirmed only by how the person now lives inside small moments that once would have ruled them. The most striking change is that life becomes less theatrical from the inside. The same events may still occur, but they no longer produce the same inner collapse. A delay is just a delay. A disagreement is just a disagreement. A mistake is a mistake, not a collapse of identity. The mind no longer rushes to inflate every disturbance into catastrophe. This does not make the person numb. It makes them accurate. Accuracy is one of the clearest fruits of inner freedom. The person sees more proportion clearly because they are not constantly distorting reality through fear or pride. They begin to understand that not every feeling is a verdict, not every thought is a truth, and not every tension requires immediate action. This is the maturity that silence, restraint, and repeated observation cultivate over time. What had once felt like a battle against the self gradually becomes a steadier relationship with the self. There is less hostility, less panic, less compulsion to fix every state, as if human life were a problem to be solved by force. Instead, the person learns to cooperate with the mind while not being owned by it. That cooperation is subtle, but it changes everything about how suffering is met. There is also a new honesty about limits. The person no longer pretends that growth means never being disturbed. Disturbance still comes. The difference is that it no longer automatically becomes identity. The mind can register pain without writing a permanent story around it. This is one of the deepest forms of relief available to a human being, because it loosens the grip of the false permanence that suffering often creates. And with that loosening, the person becomes more human, not less. They are more patient, more exact, more capable of care that is not tangled with ego. Their stability is not deadness. It is a living steadiness that allows both strength and tenderness to coexist. That steadiness has an ethical effect that is easy to overlook. A person who is less reactive causes less unnecessary damage. They interrupt fewer conversations with defensiveness. They impose fewer emotional storms on others. They do not require the people around them to constantly manage their moods. In that way, inner freedom is not only a personal achievement, it is also a form of relational responsibility. This matters because so much harm is accidental in appearance but habitual in structure. People repeat the pain they inherited. They dominate because they were dominated. They withdraw because they were abandoned. They accuse because they fear being exposed. They cling because they fear being left. The reactive life spreads suffering outward while insisting it is just trying to survive. But when the person learns to pause, the chain weakens. The harm does not have to be exported so quickly. That is one reason the unreactive life has moral weight. It makes generosity less contaminated by need and restraint less contaminated by fear. The person can say no without hatred, yes without dependency, and enough without resentment. Their behavior becomes cleaner because their interior life is cleaner. They are no longer endlessly negotiating with insecurity in every interaction. This cleaner life is also easier to trust. People sense when someone is not trying to use them as a mirror, a shield, or a remedy. They sense when a person can be present without hidden agendas. That kind of presence is rare, and rarity makes it powerful. Not because it dominates, but because it steadies. It creates an atmosphere in which others can breathe more freely too. The irony is that the more the person stops chasing power in the reactive sense, the more influence they often have. Not because they are pushing harder, but because they are no longer leaking force into self-protection. Their attention is available, their words are less crowded, their silence has weight, their actions are not inflated by the need to be seen. That is the kind of authority that does not need to announce itself. It comes from consistency between inner clarity and outer behavior. And that consistency is one of the strongest signs that the old slavery is genuinely ending. Consistency is powerful because it gives the mind something better than inspiration: reliability. Inspiration can make a person feel transformed, but reliability makes transformation usable. It means the person can return to the same principles under pressure. Not just when conditions are favorable. They can keep the pause alive in conversation, in conflict, in disappointment, and in fatigue. They no longer depend on perfect emotional weather to remain aligned. This is where many people discover that the real test of growth is not insight but continuity. Can you remain clear when tired? Can you remain patient when misunderstood? Can you remain measured when embarrassed? Can you remain honest when defensive instincts are active? These are not glamorous questions, but they reveal whether the self is truly changing or merely enjoying a temporary mood. Continuity also protects against spiritual vanity. A person can have a meaningful realization and still be deeply reactive the next day. That does not make the realization false, but it does mean the work is unfinished. Continuity keeps the person grounded in process rather than fantasy. It reminds them that the path is measured by repeated return, not by one impressive moment. There is something deeply stabilizing in this recognition. The person no longer feels that they have failed simply because old habits appeared again. They understand that recurrence is not the same as defeat. What matters is whether the recurrence now meets a different response. That is where change becomes visible. The same trigger appears, but the same surrender does not have to follow. Over time, these altered responses reshape identity. The person starts to trust a version of themselves that does not panic as quickly, explain as much, or abandon the center as easily. That trust is not arrogance. It is the calm recognition that a new habit of being is taking root. And when trust is built on observed continuity, it becomes much harder to break. At that point, the person is no longer asking whether the work is real. They can feel it in the way life is now met. Life met differently is what liberation looks like from the inside. It is not always dramatic, in fact. It often looks almost invisible from the outside. Conversation still happens. The work still gets done. The grief still arrives. The joy still visits. The body still tires. The world still disappoints. But the person now meets these things with less compulsion and more clarity. The same life received by a different mind becomes a different existence. That difference is the reward of all the discipline. Not the eradication of human struggle, but the end of unnecessary inner slavery to it. The person no longer treats every passing state as a master. They no longer call every impulse a truth or every wound a destiny. They have learned through repetition that the center can remain intact even while the surface moves. This is why the calm mind is not passive. It is deeply active in a hidden way. It is continuously choosing not to surrender itself. It is continuously refusing the old shortcuts of panic, pride, and projection. It is continuously returning to the present rather than being consumed by the story. That ongoing return is a profound act of strength, and because it is strength, it can support everything else a human life needs: love, work, responsibility, grief, ambition, and rest. None of these require a shattered center. All of them benefit from a person who is more internally available than internally fragmented. The unreactive life becomes the ground on which these things can be carried with dignity. So the end of automatic slavery is not a removal from life. It is a more truthful entry into it. The person no longer arrives as a bundle of compulsions pretending to be a self. They arrive as someone who has seen the machinery, stopped worshiping it, and begun to live from a deeper place. That is the real freedom the path has been pointing toward all along. What comes after freedom is not a new identity, but a simpler relationship to being alive. The person no longer has to keep asking whether every moment is confirming or threatening them. They can let a moment be, a moment they can let silence be silence. They can let discomfort arise without immediately promoting it to a crisis. This simplicity is not childish. It is the result of seeing through a great deal of unnecessary confusion. The mind that has lived for too long in automatic reaction often believes complexity is a sign of intelligence, but much of that complexity is self-made. It comes from layering interpretation upon fear, and then layering pride upon interpretation. Once that process is seen clearly, simplicity becomes possible again. Not simplification that ignores reality, but clarity that refuses to overcomplicate it. This is one reason the unreactive life feels lighter. The person is no longer dragging around every emotional residue as if it must be solved instantly. They allow experience to move through without making each passing state into a permanent chapter. That does not erase pain, but it reduces the extra weight that comes from resistance. The burden becomes more honest, and honesty is often lighter than distortion. There is also a kind of humility in this simplicity. The person no longer assumes they must control every outcome to remain safe. They can work hard without clenching. They can care deeply without gripping. They can witness uncertainty without treating it as an insult. This is a very different mode of living from the one built on reflex, and it is often quieter than people expect. It does not advertise itself. It does not seek applause. It simply makes the inner life less chaotic, and because the inner life is less chaotic, the outer life becomes more usable. The person is able to listen better, respond more precisely, and rest more fully. Even failure is easier to metabolize because it no longer has to destroy identity in order to be acknowledged. In that sense, simplicity is not an absence, it is a refined presence. That refined presence is one of the final signs that the old slavery is no longer in charge. The old slavery survives on urgency. It tells the mind that every feeling must be answered immediately, every insult must be repelled, every uncertainty must be resolved, every lack must be filled. Urgency creates a false atmosphere of necessity. It makes the person feel trapped inside a narrow corridor where only reaction seems available. But the moment urgency is questioned, the corridor widens. This widening is crucial because many forms of suffering are intensified by the belief that there is no space around them. Once space appears, the mind can breathe again. The person can notice that a feeling is rising without needing to obey it. They can hear a thought without treating it as command. They can recognize the bodily signal without converting it into prophecy. That space is where maturity lives. Urgency also feeds the performance self. If everything must happen now, then there is no time for honesty, reflection, or proportion. The person becomes busy defending a version of themselves rather than being with what is true. But when urgency loses power, performance loses some of its grip too. The person no longer has to hurry toward a reaction to prove they are alive or important. They can remain still long enough to know what is actually needed. This is a profound recovery because many bad choices are made under the illusion that delay is dangerous. In reality, a brief pause often prevents enormous harm. A moment of restraint can save a relationship, preserve dignity, or allow insight to catch up with emotion. The pause is not merely a technique. It is the place where the person refuses to let urgency decide the shape of their life. Over time, this changes the felt experience of living. The world still moves quickly, but the person does not have to be captured by its speed. They can move within it without being owned by it. That freedom from urgency is one of the clearest indicators that automatic slavery is ending. And once urgency weakens, the mind can begin to rest in a more truthful rhythm. A truthful rhythm is one that does not demand constant intensity to justify existence. It allows work to be focused, rest to be real, grief to be mourned, joy to be enjoyed, and boredom to be tolerated without panic. Many people are unable to rest because they have unconsciously tied value to agitation. If they are not producing, solving, or reacting, they feel useless. But this is a confused measure of worth. A life does not become meaningful only when it is loud. When the mind accepts a more truthful rhythm, It learns that not every moment needs to be optimized. Some moments need to be witnessed. Some need to be endured. Some need to be left alone. This is a great relief because the compulsive mind is always trying to extract something from the present. The disciplined mind can let the present be what it is. That permission changes everything. A truthful rhythm also brings the body into the discussion. The body is often the first place where reactivity shows itself. Tension, acceleration, collapse, shallow breathing, fatigue, agitation. When the person begins to honor a slower and more honest rhythm, the body can finally stop being treated like a machine to be overridden. It becomes a partner in clarity. Its signals are not always convenient, but they are often intelligent. This is important because many people try to think their way out of emotional bondage, while ignoring the body that is carrying the pattern. But transformation becomes more durable when it includes both mind and body. Breath, posture, sleep, movement, and stillness all participate in the same shift. The person learns that calm is not just a thought, it is a way of inhabiting the organism. That embodied calm helps protect the progress already made. It keeps the inner work from becoming abstract. It anchors insight in lived reality. And when insight is embodied, it becomes far harder to lose in the heat of a difficult moment. That is how a truthful rhythm gradually replaces the false rhythm of reaction. The false rhythm of reaction is exhausting because it is always preparing for the next disturbance. Even in quiet, it scans for threats. Even in safety, it rehearses defense. Even in happiness, it anticipates loss. This is not alertness, it is captivity. The mind may think it is staying ready, but it is actually denying itself rest. And a mind denied rest becomes less wise, not more. The disciplined mind breaks this cycle by accepting intervals of nothingness. It does not immediately fill every space with stimulation. It does not interpret quiet as emptiness to be feared. Instead, it learns that pauses are not failures of activity but necessary conditions for accurate action. Without pause, there is only reflex. With pause, there is perspective. This perspective allows the person to see that much of what once felt urgent was merely repetitive. The same emotional loops, the same relational tensions, the same internal arguments appearing again and again under different disguises. Once this repetition is visible, the person can begin to step out of it. They no longer need to treat every recurrence as a new emergency. They recognize the old pattern and reduce its power by refusing to worship its novelty. There is a dignity in this recognition. It means the person is no longer confused by the theater of their own mind. They see the set, the costumes, the rehearsed lines. They know the production well enough to stop mistaking it for reality. And when the illusion of freshness drops away, the compulsion weakens too. The same scene cannot dominate quite as easily once it has been seen as a scene. This is one of the deep gifts of persistent observation. It dissolves the spell of repetition. What once governed silently now becomes visible, and what becomes visible can begin to change. The person is not cured by denial. They are freed by seeing that freedom, repeated enough times, becomes a form of peace. Peace is often imagined as a reward for solving life, but it is more accurately the result of no longer demanding that life conform to egoic preferences before it can be lived. The person stops trying to secure an unbreakable arrangement and starts learning how to stand in the middle of change without constantly struggling against it. This is why peace can coexist with difficulty. It is not the absence of storms. It is the absence of inner panic about storms. A peaceful mind is not necessarily a quiet environment. It is a mind that has learned not to multiply disturbance. It does not take every setback as proof of futility. It does not take every praise as proof of specialness. It does not take every emotion as a permanent truth. It receives experience with less distortion and therefore suffers less from its own commentary. This peace is deeply practical. It improves judgment. It softens conflict. It helps the person know when to speak and when to wait. It protects energy from being wasted on battles that exist only because the ego wants to win something unnecessary. Peace does not make the person inert. It makes them selective. They stop fighting everything and start meeting only what matters. That selectivity changes the texture of relationships too. The person listens more carefully because they are less busy preparing a defense. They apologize more cleanly because they are less attached to appearing flawless. They can disagree without converting the disagreement into moral war. These qualities are not trivial. They make human life more livable for everyone involved. In that way, peace is not merely private well-being, it is a social gift. A peaceful person reduces friction around them because they are less driven by the hidden compulsions that create friction in the first place. They become easier to trust, easier to love, and are less likely to weaponize their own discomfort. That is the quiet power of a mind no longer governed by automatic slavery. It does not simply survive life. It helps make life less harsh. What remains then is stewardship. The person is no longer trying to conquer the self, nor to indulge it, nor to perform it. They are learning to steward it, to tend the mind the way one tends a flame, not by smothering it, not by letting it rage unchecked, but by keeping it steady enough to be useful. Stewardship is a mature form of responsibility because it assumes neither perfection nor helplessness. It works with what is real. A steward does not ask for a life without weather. They ask for the skill to navigate weather without losing the vessel. This is an excellent image for inner life because the vessel matters. If the mind is constantly cracked by reaction, it cannot carry love, insight, grief, or duty for long. But if it is cared for with patience, boundaries, and clarity, it becomes capable of holding much more than it once could. This care is ongoing. There is no final state where the work ends and the mind never again wavers. But there can be a deepening stability, where wavering no longer becomes collapse. The person knows how to return. They know how to pause. They know how to observe without immediately obeying. They know how to let emotion pass through without turning it into a prison. That knowledge is not abstract. It is lived. In the end, the entire path points toward this simple dignity. A person inhabiting their own mind without being enslaved by it. That is enough to transform the quality of a life. It changes how one speaks, how one listens, how one loves, how one rests, how one fails, and how one begins again. It does not make the person invulnerable. It makes them less captive. And when captivity fades, what appears is not emptiness but room. Room to breathe, room to choose, room to be present without fear. Room to live as someone no longer ruled from within. Room is where real life can finally begin to breathe. Not the fantasy of a life without difficulty, but a life no longer congested by constant inner interference. Once the mind has some room, it can meet events more directly. It can let grief be grief, work be work, silence be silence, and love be love, without immediately turning each one into an argument with reality. That room is not given once and preserved forever. It has to be protected through repeated attention. The old patterns will try to fill it again. They will bring urgency, comparison, resentment, and self-importance back to the threshold. But now the person knows those visitors by name. They are no longer mysterious rulers, they are habits, and habits can be observed. Once observed, they can lose their authority. This is why maturity often looks understated. It does not need to announce itself with constant intensity. It is visible in the person who can remain receptive without becoming chaotic, decisive without becoming harsh, and open without becoming porous. They have learned that strength and softness are not enemies. Strength without softness becomes brutality. Softness without strength becomes collapse. The mature mind contains both. There is also a quiet dignity in not needing to win every inner battle publicly. The person no longer has to make a spectacle out of suffering in order to prove it is real. They can carry pain privately and honestly. They can admit uncertainty without theatrical collapse. They can remain steady in the presence of ambiguity. That steadiness is not emptiness. It is the result of having met enough of one's own mind to no longer be frightened by every passing wave. And because they are less frightened, they are less controlling. They stop trying to force life into a shape that protects the ego at all costs. They allow experience to have texture again. That texture is what makes life vivid. And vividness does not require chaos. It requires presence. Room, then, is not just a metaphor. It is the interior condition in which presence becomes possible. Presence is often mistaken for attention, but it is deeper than that. Attention can be narrow, fragmented, or performative. Presence is what remains when attention stops being used as a weapon against discomfort. It is the willingness to stay with what is here without immediately turning away, fixing, naming, or consuming it. Presence does not always produce answers right away, but it produces contact. and contact is the beginning of wisdom. The reactive mind hates presence because presence slows its escape routes. It can no longer flee into commentary quite so easily. It can no longer hide behind busyness with the same confidence. It has to sit in the actual moment, where the body is speaking, the emotions are moving, and the mind is revealing its habits. This is uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. What is truly present can be worked with. What is avoided merely keeps shaping the self from the shadows. Presence also restores proportion. In reaction, everything is magnified. A small slight becomes an identity wound. A delay becomes rejection. A mistake becomes proof of inadequacy. But when presence is strong, the person can feel the size of a thing more accurately. They can distinguish a passing irritation from a genuine rupture. They can tell whether a fear is current reality or old memory. That proportion saves enormous amounts of energy. And because energy is no longer being wasted on overreaction, it can be used for actual life. Work gets cleaner, conversations get truer, rest becomes possible without guilt. Even solitude changes, because the person is no longer alone with a hostile inner court. They are alone with themselves in a more honest way, which is very different. Solitude then becomes restorative rather than accusatory. This is one of the deepest fruits of the path. The person learns that presence is not a passive state. It is a disciplined way of not abandoning reality. That discipline is what makes life more stable, more humane, and more free. Freedom becomes believable only when it can survive the ordinary pressures of being human. No one is free merely because they understand the concept. Freedom shows itself when the difficult email arrives, when the criticism stings, when the old insecurity wakes up, when the body is tired, when the world refuses to cooperate, and the person still does not collapse into automatic reaction. This is the test that matters. Can the center remain intact when the surface is unsettled? The answer is not always yes, and that honesty matters. The path is not a fantasy of permanent mastery. It is a real training in returning. The person may still react sometimes, but now the reaction is seen sooner, caught earlier, and fed less. That is progress. It may not look dramatic, but it is the difference between being dragged and being aware while being pulled, which is already a major shift. This means freedom is not a single door. It is a repeated orientation again and again. The person chooses not to let the immediate state determine the whole identity. Again and again they return to breath, to observation, to proportion, to clarity. Again and again, they notice that the first interpretation is not always the truest one. These repetitions carve new pathways into the mind, and once those pathways are established, the old slavery starts to feel less like fate and more like a habit that has finally lost its glamour. That loss of glamour is important because much of reactivity is sustained by drama. It feels important because it feels intense, but intensity is not always significance. The liberated mind learns to value what is accurate over what is loud. That preference changes the structure of the self. The person is less available to manipulation, both by others and by their own inherited fears. They become easier to live with internally, and therefore easier to live with externally. Freedom, in that sense, is not an abstraction. It is the gradual replacement of compulsion with choice, and choice, repeated enough times, becomes character. Character is what remains when the moment of choice has been lived through so often that it no longer feels exceptional. The person no longer has to conjure restraint as an extraordinary effort. It is simply part of how they move through the world. This does not mean there is no struggle. It means struggle is no longer automatically allowed to define conduct. The person has become familiar enough with their own mind to meet it with skill. That skill includes gentleness. The disciplined life is sometimes imagined as severe, but severity alone cannot sustain transformation. If the person treats themselves with contempt each time they fail, they create a second problem on top of the first. Real discipline is firm without being cruel. It holds the line while preserving dignity. It says, "Not this again," without saying, "You are nothing." That distinction is crucial. Over time, this gentleness makes continued practice possible. The person does not quit every time the old reflex returns. They understand that recurrence is part of the terrain. They do not romanticize themselves as finished. They simply continue. This continuity is what allows the deeper change to remain alive after the first enthusiasm has passed. Character is built not in the moments of inspiration, but in the ordinary decision to remain faithful to what has been seen. A strong character, then, is not a rigid one. It is a reliable one. It can bend without breaking. It can feel without drowning. It can endure pressure without becoming mean. It can say no without aggression and yes without surrender. Such a person is not detached from life. They are deeply available to it, because they are no longer spending all their energy on internal firefighting. This is the end point toward which all the earlier parts have been moving. The self is no longer automatically enslaved by reaction, because it has learned a different mode of existence, present, steady, and free enough to remain human under pressure. A reliable self is not built by endless self-critique, but by repeated self-contact. The person learns to remain near their own experience long enough to understand it rather than flee it. That closeness is what makes change possible, because what is abandoned cannot be transformed. The mind that stays present with itself becomes less mysterious, and what is less mysterious is less frightening. This is why the work is so often quiet. The most important victories happen without spectacle. The moment you do not speak too quickly, the moment you do not personalize what was not personal, the moment you let a feeling move without turning it into a command. These are small acts, but they are the exact places where the old slavery weakens. Each one says, in effect, that the self is no longer for sale to the first disturbance. It is also worth noticing that freedom does not eliminate pain, it changes the terms under which pain is carried. Pain no longer gets an automatic promotion to identity. Loss no longer becomes total collapse. Fear no longer becomes prophecy. The person still feels deeply, but feeling no longer has the final word. That difference is what makes the mind lighter without making it shallow. A lighter mind is not a careless mind. It is a mind with less clutter between experience and response. It can respond more directly because it is not buried under layers of self-protection. The result is often a kind of graceful practicality. The person does what is needed without making everything about themselves. That is a rare form of dignity, and dignity, once it becomes stable, alters the whole atmosphere of a life. It becomes possible to move through difficulty without contempt, to hold uncertainty without panic, and to remain open without losing the center. That is not a small achievement. It is the quiet end of a great many inner wars. When the inner wars subside, the person begins to see how much energy was once spent defending illusions. The need to be right, the need to be admired, the need to be untouchable, the need to appear unaffected, all of these require enormous fuel. The reactive self burns constantly to keep its image warm. But once the image is no longer worshipped, that energy can be redirected toward what is real. Attention, care, work, presence, and honest relation. This redirection changes how the person feels time. Instead of constantly rushing toward the next emotional resolution, they can remain with the interval between stimulus and response. That interval becomes valuable, not empty. It is where discernment lives. It is where the person can ask whether the response they are about to give is proportional, truthful, and necessary. Without that interval, life becomes a series of half-conscious decisions. With it, life becomes more intentional. The shift also affects how the person experiences other people. They stop seeing every disagreement as a threat to belonging. They stop hearing every difference as dismissal. They become less likely to project old wounds onto present relationships. This does not make them naive. It makes them more accurate. They can tell when something is genuinely harmful and when it is merely uncomfortable. That distinction protects both self-respect and compassion. Over time, this accuracy becomes its own quiet confidence. The person does not need to announce that they have grown. Their behavior reveals it. They are less reactive, more measured, less entangled in performance. They know when to act and when to wait. They know when a feeling is information and when it is residue. They know that peace is not the absence of life, but the absence of unnecessary internal warfare. And once unnecessary warfare ends, the life that remains is more available to itself. That availability is one of the most profound forms of freedom a human being can know. Availability to life is what makes the mature mind feel spacious. It is no longer so crowded with self-maintenance that there is no room for direct experience. The person can hear what is being said, feel what is being felt, and notice what is happening without instantly translating everything into self-defense. That spaciousness does not appear by accident. It is built through repeated acts of non-reactivity, each one making a little more room. At first, this room may feel unfamiliar. The reactive mind often confuses spaciousness with vulnerability because it has lived for so long in cramped alertness. But spaciousness is actually protective in a deeper sense. It allows the person to see more clearly before responding. It gives emotions room to complete their movement. It prevents the mind from mistaking one intense moment for the whole truth of a situation. In that way, room is not emptiness. It is capacity. Capacity changes everything. A person with capacity can remain with pain without making it catastrophic. They can remain with uncertainty without becoming paralyzed. They can remain with success without becoming inflated. They can hold complexity without forcing it into a simple story just to reduce discomfort. This ability is rare because it requires trust in awareness itself, not just trust in mood or impulse. The person begins to understand that awareness can contain more than reaction can. Awareness can hold contradiction. It can observe a wound without becoming a wound. It can notice fear without becoming fear. It can witness desire without immediately obeying desire. This is a quiet but extraordinary form of strength. It means the person is no longer enslaved by the first form their mind takes, and because they are not enslaved by the first form, they are free to meet the deeper one. That is the difference between a life driven by reflex and a life shaped by wisdom. Wisdom is often mistaken for having the right answer, but it is more accurately the ability to stay with reality long enough not to need a false one. The wise person does not rush to fill every uncertainty with certainty. They can tolerate not knowing. They can postpone a reaction until it has been examined. They can remain open to correction without treating correction as humiliation. This makes wisdom quieter than pride, but far more durable. The reactive self dislikes not knowing because not knowing threatens control. It wants immediate closure, immediate explanation, immediate relief. But much of life does not cooperate with that demand. Relationships remain partly mysterious. Human motives are mixed. Consequences unfold slowly. Emotions can take time to reveal their meaning. Wisdom respects this. It does not force premature conclusions just to calm anxiety. This respect for uncertainty is one of the deepest freedoms the person can develop. It keeps the mind from becoming a prisoner of its own certainty. It allows room for learning. It prevents small events from being inflated into final judgments. It keeps the heart more honest too, because honesty often requires staying present with ambiguity longer than comfort prefers. At this stage, the person may notice that they are less interested in being impressive and more interested in being true. That shift is subtle but transformative. Impressive behavior often serves the ego. Truth serves life. The more the person prefers truth, the less they are tempted to construct an identity around reaction. They can simply remain present, responsive, and real. That reality is not always glamorous, but it is freeing, and the longer it is practiced, the more natural it becomes to live without the exhausting need for inner theater. Without inner theater, the personality begins to simplify, not in the sense of becoming flat, but in the sense of becoming less fragmented. The person is no longer constantly splitting into performer, critic, victim, defender, and witness. Those roles still arise sometimes, but they no longer dominate the whole stage. There is a more stable continuity underneath them, and that continuity makes life feel more coherent. Coherence matters because fragmentation is tiring. When the self must keep switching masks in order to survive its own emotional landscape, it loses contact with its deeper center. But when the person is no longer performing identity all day, they regain access to a more integrated way of being. They can act from clarity, rather than from whichever role is shouting loudest. This reduces internal friction and produces a calmer kind of presence. A calmer presence is not weak. It is harder to destabilize because it is not relying on performance for support. It does not need every interaction to reinforce the same self-image. It can adapt without dissolving. It can absorb tension without becoming it. That flexibility is one of the clearest signs of true maturity. It shows that the person is no longer locked into a single defensive pattern. This is also where compassion becomes cleaner. A fragmented person often confuses compassion with rescuing, appeasing, or over-identifying. But an integrated person can care without merging. They can help without losing themselves. They can witness suffering without making it theatrical. They can remain kind without becoming captive. This makes their love more trustworthy because it is less entangled with hidden demands. And once the self is less fragmented, there is more room for simple sincerity. Sincerity is just contact without performance. It is the natural expression of a mind that no longer has to split itself to survive. That may be the most elegant sign that automatic slavery is truly fading. Sincerity has a power that intensity rarely matches. Intensity can impress, but sincerity endures. It does not need to shout to be real. It is visible in the person who says what they mean without trying to dominate the room, who listens without secretly preparing their next offense, who can admit uncertainty without feeling diminished by it. This kind of honesty is not dramatic, but it is profoundly stabilizing. The reason sincerity is so powerful is that it reduces the gap between inner life and outer behavior. Many people suffer because their public self and private self are constantly negotiating. They present one version while feeling another, and the tension between the two consumes enormous energy. Sincerity loosens that strain. The person becomes less split, less performative, and therefore more restful to inhabit. This does not mean the person says everything at every moment. Sincerity is not impulsive disclosure. It is alignment. It means the words, actions, and silences are not systematically betraying the deeper truth of the person's experience. That alignment is one of the most reliable foundations for trust, both with others and with oneself. When sincerity becomes normal, the person starts to notice how much social life is held together by avoidances, performances, and small deceptions. They may not become cynical about this, but they do become clearer about the cost. To live sincerely is to stop paying that cost so often. It is to let life be less decorated and more direct. That directness can feel exposed at first, but it quickly proves to be lighter than pretending. This lighter life is not a fantasy of purity. It still includes confusion, conflict, and recovery. But the recovery happens faster because there is less to defend. The person can return to center sooner, and that ability to return, again and again, is what makes sincerity not just admirable but sustainable. Sustainability is what turns insight into life. A single moment of clarity can inspire, but only a sustainable pattern can transform. The person who has learned to pause, observe, and return does not need every day to be extraordinary. They can build a life that remains workable under ordinary pressure. This is one of the deepest forms of freedom because it is independent of mood. Mood is unstable. It shifts with sleep, stress, memory, and circumstance. If freedom depends on mood, freedom will disappear often. But if freedom is rooted in practiced return, then it becomes much more dependable. The person may still feel anger, shame, grief, excitement, or fatigue. But these states no longer get to decide the entire architecture of the self. This shift matters especially in long-term change. People often underestimate how much of transformation is simply the accumulation of stable choices. One honest pause, then another. One delayed reaction, then another. One clear boundary, then another. One refusal to dramatize, then another. These choices may feel small in the moment, but over time they alter the shape of the mind. They create a person who can endure without hardening and care without collapsing. Sustainability also protects against despair. If the person expects perfection, every relapse becomes a crisis. But if they understand that the work is built on repetition, setbacks become part of the terrain rather than evidence of failure. That perspective is very important because it keeps the person moving. They do not abandon the path simply because old reflexes reappear. They know how to continue, and continuation is one of the most underrated forms of strength. To continue without illusion, without self-contempt, and without giving the old slavery its thrown back, that is real maturity. It is not glamorous, but it is transformational. And at a certain point, transformation no longer feels like effort. It feels like home. Home is the place where the self no longer has to perform its belonging. It can settle, it can breathe, it can be imperfect without panic. When inner freedom becomes steady, the person begins to feel at home in their own awareness. Not because everything is solved, but because they no longer need to leave themselves each time something painful appears. That is a remarkable relief. Being at home in awareness means the person can observe a storm without becoming the storm. They can register sadness without becoming hopeless, anger without becoming cruel, desire without becoming dependent. The emotions are allowed, but they are no longer sovereign. They pass through a space that is larger than any one of them. That space is the home. This home does not remove responsibility. It deepens it. A person who is at home in themselves is more capable of responding to others with patience and proportion. They are less likely to use people as instruments for regulating their own discomfort. They can enter relationship more cleanly because they are not constantly trying to use the relationship to patch over inner instability. That makes them safer and often kinder. This kind of homecoming also clarifies what spirituality is for. It is not a performance of transcendence. It is the gradual ending of self-division. It is the movement from being ruled by every disturbance to being able to meet disturbance without losing the center. Whether one uses religious language or not, the result is similar. Less captivity, more reality, more room for what is true. And when truth is lived rather than merely admired, the life that emerges is not heroic in the dramatic sense. It is simply more whole, more able to hold pain without collapsing, joy without grasping, and change without panic. That wholeness is quiet, but it is durable. It is also the clearest sign that the person has crossed from automatic slavery into a freer way of being. The freer life does not remove difficulty. It removes the habit of kneeling before difficulty, as if it were absolute. The person still encounters loss, pressure, confusion, and fatigue, but these no longer possess the same right to define the whole inner world. Something more stable has appeared, a center that does not disappear each time circumstances become sharp. This center is not dramatic, it is dependable. Dependability is one of the most underrated virtues because it lacks spectacle. Yet it is exactly what makes inner freedom livable. The person can now trust that a storm inside does not automatically require surrender. They can trust that a thought is not a verdict, that a wound is not an identity, and that a difficult hour does not have to become a ruined day. This trust is not naive. It is built from observation, repetition, and survival without self-abandonment. There is great dignity in becoming someone who can stay. Stay with pain long enough to understand it. Stay with uncertainty long enough not to falsify it. Stay with silence long enough to hear what was hidden beneath noise. Stay with one's own mind long enough for it to stop appearing as an enemy. This capacity to remain is one of the clearest marks of a person who is no longer ruled by reflex. And because they can remain, they no longer need to reach for false relief so quickly. They do not need to retaliate to feel strong, to explain to feel real, or to dominate to feel safe. They can let many things pass without feeling erased by them. They can face what matters without multiplying what does not. This simplifies life in the deepest possible way. A simplified life is not empty. It is less clogged, less crowded by unnecessary argument, emotional theater, and the compulsive management of appearance. Such a life has room for the things that actually deserve attention. Truth, work, love, grief, beauty, responsibility, rest. These things become more visible when reaction stops monopolizing the stage. So what appears at this stage is not perfection, but a kind of interior adulthood. The person has stopped expecting the world to stop being difficult and has instead become more capable of meeting difficulty without servitude. That is a sober freedom, but also a beautiful one. Interior adulthood begins where blame starts to lose its glamour. The reactive self loves blame because blame offers immediate structure. It explains discomfort quickly. It gives the mind a target. It protects identity from the harder task of self-examination. But blame, even when partially justified, often becomes a narcotic. It relieves the burden of looking inward by placing the whole drama outside. A mature mind does not deny that others can wound, deceive, fail, or behave unjustly. It simply refuses to let external fault become the permanent organizer of inner life. It asks a more difficult question. What now belongs to my responsibility? What story am I continuing? What pattern am I feeding? What part of this pain is being prolonged by my attachment to being injured? These are not questions of self-betrayal. They are questions of liberation. The person who can ask them has crossed an important threshold. They no longer confuse self-protection with self-knowledge. They understand that even valid pain can become a prison if it is repeatedly used to stabilize identity. This is why maturity is not softness toward illusion. It is firmness toward one's own tendency to stay entangled in it. That firmness is not cruel, it is clarifying. Clarity changes the emotional economy of life. The person spends less energy prosecuting every disappointment and more energy understanding what must actually be faced. This often leads to cleaner decisions. Some relationships must be left. Some patterns must be interrupted. Some expectations must die. Some truths must be accepted without negotiation. The reactive mind delays these movements because it prefers emotional drama to decisive honesty. The mature mind does not. This does not mean adulthood is joyless. In fact, joy becomes more available when blame stops consuming attention. There is more room for appreciation when the mind is not constantly arranging evidence for its grievances. There is more gratitude when life is no longer being measured solely by what failed to happen. Maturity does not erase sorrow. It simply stops using sorrow as the sole lens through which everything is seen. That shift is one of the quiet miracles of inner work. The world remains imperfect, but the self is no longer organized mainly around protest. Once protest is no longer the main organizing principle, attention can become more creative. It is no longer trapped in constant resistance to what has already occurred. It can move toward what is possible. This is where inner freedom begins to change not only how the person feels, but what they can build. Energy that was once lost to rumination becomes available for action, service, and meaningful effort. Creativity here does not only mean art. It means the capacity to generate a wiser response than the one habit would have supplied, to speak differently in an old conflict, to love differently in a familiar fear, to rest differently in a body accustomed to pressure, to work differently without tying worth to output. These are creative acts because they interrupt repetition and produce a new reality. The person becomes, in a quiet sense, an author again. This authorship is one of the great recoveries made possible by non-reactivity. A reactive life is largely edited by the past. Old wounds, old conclusions, and old defenses keep revising the present before it can fully arrive. But when the person becomes less automatic, the past loses some editorial control. It can still inform, but it no longer dictates with the same force. This gives the present back its freedom. There is profound relief in this. The person no longer has to live as if every moment were already written by yesterday's pain. They can revise, they can interrupt, they can choose. They can build something gentler and truer than what instinct alone would have produced. This is why freedom from automatic slavery is not merely defensive, it is generative. It creates conditions under which a different kind of life can emerge, and that life often looks less spectacular than people imagine. It may look like a calmer home, a clearer boundary, a more honest conversation, a less frantic schedule, a more faithful practice, a deeper sleep, a softened tone, a less noisy ambition. But these are not small things, they are the architecture of a life no longer dominated by inner chaos. To create such a life is not to escape humanity. It is to inhabit it more consciously. Conscious inhabitation means the person is no longer merely passing through their own days in a haze of reaction. They are in contact with how they speak, how they tense, how they hurry, how they avoid, how they attach, how they defend, and how they love. This contact is not obsessive self-monitoring. It is informed presence. The person lives closer to the controls of their own life. Living near the controls changes what responsibility feels like. It is no longer just duty imposed from outside. It becomes stewardship from within. The person notices that every repeated reaction strengthens a groove. Every practice pause deepens a path. Every act of honesty stabilizes the center a little more. In this way, the self is shaped gradually, and shaping becomes a moral act. One is always becoming more capable of freedom or more accustomed to captivity. This recognition can feel sobering, but it is also empowering. It means the person does not have to wait for a perfect breakthrough to begin living differently. Every ordinary moment contains leverage. The next breath, the next sentence, the next refusal to dramatize, the next willingness to stay silent, the next act of proportion. All of these are real opportunities. The path is not elsewhere. It is here, hidden inside the smallest moments of conduct. That is why conscious living eventually becomes simpler than reactive living. Even if it is harder at first, reaction multiplies problems. Consciousness reduces unnecessary multiplication. It cannot spare the person from loss, error, or mortality, but it can prevent those realities from being continuously worsened by panic and ego. This is a major mercy. It is one the disciplined mind learns to appreciate deeply. The more this appreciation grows, the less attractive the old chaos becomes. Drama starts to look expensive. Compulsion starts to feel crude. The person becomes less willing to hand over hours, days, or relationships to patterns that they now recognize as thieves. This is not repression, it is discernment, and discernment is one of the final protections of freedom. Without it, the mind easily falls back in love with what once imprisoned it. One of the strangest things about inner bondage is that it can become familiar enough to feel intimate. A person can mistake their own turbulence for personality. They can believe they would disappear without their urgency, their dramatization, their defenses, their constant emotional weather. This is why liberation sometimes feels at first like a loss. The old noise had become a companion. It gave shape, momentum, and predictable conflict. Without it, the person may briefly feel undefined. But this undefining is not emptiness in the negative sense. It is the clearing in which something more truthful can form. The person begins to discover who they are without the compulsive need to prove, defend, and repeat. This discovery is often slower than expected, because the deepest self does not emerge through performance. It emerges through subtraction. Less panic, less vanity, less fear of being ordinary, less compulsion to be seen, less dependence on friction for aliveness. As these false supports weaken, a more grounded identity appears. Not an identity built from slogans or self-descriptions, but one made visible through conduct, through how the person responds when ignored, criticized, delayed, contradicted, praised, or disappointed. Character becomes more informative than narrative. The person trusts what they repeatedly do, more than what they dramatically claim about themselves. This shift changes self-respect. Self-respect is no longer based mainly on image or achievement. It is based on whether the person can remain internally honorable under pressure. Can they tell the truth when afraid? Can they keep proportion when angry? Can they avoid cruelty when wounded? Can they refrain from self-betrayal when longing for approval? These are the places where respect becomes real. There is something deeply stabilizing about earning one's own trust in this way. The person no longer needs endless external confirmation because they have begun to witness evidence of reliability from within. Not perfection, but sincerity under pressure. Not flawlessness, but a repeated unwillingness to abandon the center. That kind of trust quiets many unnecessary hungers, and when unnecessary hunger quiets, desire itself becomes cleaner. A cleaner desire is one that no longer tries to use the world as a substitute for an ungoverned inner life. The person can still want success, intimacy, beauty, rest, meaning, recognition, and pleasure. But these wants are no longer so desperate. They are less entangled with panic. Desire becomes less like grasping and more like movement. It does not have to secure the self's existence in order to be felt fully. This matters because many people do not suffer mainly from wanting too much, but from asking desire to solve problems it cannot solve. They want love to erase insecurity, achievement to erase self-doubt, attention to erase invisibility, certainty to erase vulnerability. These are impossible assignments. When desire is burdened with them, it becomes frantic and distorted. The person chases not just the object, but the fantasy that the object will rescue the self from its own unrest. The disciplined mind begins to see through this fantasy. It recognizes that no external arrangement can permanently stabilize a mind that refuses to know itself. This realization does not make desire meaningless. It makes it honest. The person can want things deeply without lying to themselves about what those things can provide. They can enjoy, pursue, and build without expecting each gain to redeem the whole of life. That honesty makes desire less violent. The person is less likely to exploit others for emotional regulation. Less likely to clutch at outcomes as if survival depends on them. Less likely to collapse when reality withholds what was wanted. This creates a calmer, cleaner form of ambition and attachment. One can care without begging reality to become a servant of ego. Such desire is far more compatible with peace. It does not constantly place peace in the future, after the next acquisition, validation, or victory. It allows peace to coexist with aspiration. The person can strive without self-erosion. They can long without kneeling. They can lose without disappearing. This is a major sign that freedom is no longer fragile. And once freedom is no longer fragile, the person is able to carry power more responsibly. Power is dangerous when it enters an unexamined mind. It amplifies whatever disorder is already present. If the person is ruled by insecurity, power becomes domination. If they are ruled by hunger, power becomes extraction. If they are ruled by injury, power becomes revenge. This is why inner work matters so much. It determines whether increased capacity will deepen freedom or merely magnify bondage. A person who has learned not to be ruled by every impulse can hold power with more steadiness. They do not need to use every advantage to prove significance. They do not need constant submission from others in order to feel intact. They do not confuse control with strength. Because their inner center is less unstable, they are less likely to treat power as medication for self-doubt. That alone prevents enormous harm. This applies not only to formal authority, but to all forms of influence: social, emotional, professional, intellectual. Everyone has some capacity to affect others. The question is whether that capacity is being guided by clarity or by compulsion. The unreactive person is not automatically virtuous, but they are better positioned to act without the distortions that come from panic and vanity. Their restraint protects more than themselves. There is also a paradox here. The person who no longer craves power in the old egoic sense often becomes more trustworthy with it. Because they are not desperate to secure identity through domination, they can use influence more proportionally. They can listen. They can revise. They can admit error. They can act firmly without needing to crush. This is a rare and deeply needed form of strength. Such strength is not based on force of personality alone. It is based on force held in discipline. It has edges, but they are governed. It has intensity, but not leakage. It has conviction, but also listening. This is what happens when power is carried by a mind that has undergone enough purification to stop using others as emotional scaffolding. And wherever such a mind appears, life around it tends to become less violent, less chaotic, and more lucid. Lucidity is one of the final fruits of the path because it joins calm with insight. A calm person is not necessarily lucid, they may simply be dulled or withdrawn. A sharp person is not necessarily lucid, they may simply be fast and restless. Lucidity combines steadiness with clear perception. It sees what is happening without the usual fog of panic, vanity, or denial. It is a rare human achievement. The lucid mind no longer needs to decorate reality in order to endure it. It does not require constant consolation through fantasy. It can look at impermanence, disappointment, aging, ambiguity, and the limits of control without immediately collapsing into bitterness or distraction. This capacity is not morbid. It is liberating. Much suffering comes from refusing to see what is already true. Lucidity ends that refusal. At the same time, lucidity is not cold. In fact, it often allows for warmer contact with life because it removes so much distortion. The person can appreciate things more honestly when they are not trying to own them forever. They can love people more cleanly when they stop demanding that love eliminate uncertainty. They can work more devotedly when they stop requiring work to define the entirety of self. Lucidity makes affection, effort, and presence more realistic, and therefore more durable. This realism is one of the most compassionate things a person can develop. It prevents unnecessary promises. It softens unnecessary disappointment. It allows grief and gratitude to coexist. It makes the person less brittle, because they are no longer negotiating against the basic structure of reality. They live with more accord and less argument. At that point, the end of automatic slavery becomes unmistakable. The self is no longer chained to its first reaction, its oldest wound, or its loudest fear. It can still be touched, but it is harder to capture. It can still be moved, but not so easily governed. It can still suffer, but not so blindly. That is freedom in a form robust enough to live in the real world. And from there, the last movement is not toward escape, but toward integration so complete that freedom begins to feel ordinary. When freedom becomes ordinary, it stops feeling like an achievement and starts feeling like good posture of the soul. The person does not wake each day announcing liberation to themselves. They simply move with less distortion. They notice a reaction earlier. They interrupt a compulsion sooner. They recover from inner turbulence faster. This kind of steady continuation is what turns practice into character, and durable change depends more on that repetition than on any single breakthrough. Ordinary freedom also means the person no longer needs constant proof that they are progressing. Long-form development, whether in a manuscript or in a mind, often advances through sustained continuation rather than visible dramatic leaps. What matters is that the next page is cleaner than the last, the next response less captive than the previous one, and the next silence less frightening than before. Yamajin HTTP Lamajin.T-Story. At this stage, the self becomes less fascinated with its own turbulence. Old patterns may still appear, but they do not command the same reverence. The person sees them as recurring structures rather than sacred truths. This weakens their hypnotic force. The mind no longer says, "This is who I am." It says, "This is what is happening." That difference preserves freedom. A great deal of suffering survives because it is narrated too quickly. The disciplined mind delays that narration. It lets sensation remain sensation a little longer. It lets uncertainty stay open a little longer. It lets emotion move without immediately converting it into identity. That delay is not emptiness. It is intelligence under restraint. And because intelligence is now less theatrical, it becomes more exact. The person does not over-explain every hurt or over-elevate every desire. They begin to trust proportion more than intensity. In doing so, they step even further away from the old slavery that depended on exaggeration to maintain itself. The deeper freedom is not simply that one reacts less. It is that one belongs to oneself more fully. The inner seat of authorship is no longer rented out to fear, praise, insult, or impatience. Experience still passes through, but it does not seize the throne so easily. This gives life a different gravity. The person is no longer being thrown outward by every passing weather system of the mind. Belonging to oneself also changes solitude. Solitude is no longer an empty chamber where unresolved thought grows louder without limit. It becomes a place where the person can return, listen, and reassemble without panic. This is one of the clearest signs of maturity, the ability to be alone without becoming divided against oneself. In such a life, silence regains dignity. It is no longer merely the gap between distractions. It becomes the medium in which perception clears. The person learns again that not everything must be answered, not everything must be resolved at once, and not everything that rises inside deserves a future. What remains in the end is not a superhuman state, but a human one purified of some unnecessary suffering. The person still grieves, still desires, still fails, still hopes. But they do these things with less inner servitude. They are less likely to multiply pain through panic, less likely to mistake urgency for truth, and less likely to build identity out of their sharpest passing states. That is enough to alter the entire texture of existence. So the final movement is not upward into abstraction, but inward into steadiness, and outward into cleaner action. The person becomes easier to trust because they are less divided. They become easier to love because they are less defended by reflex. They become easier to be because they no longer require so much emotional theater to feel real. This is not the end of being human. It is the end of being so easily ruled. And once that rule is broken often enough, the rest of life can begin to unfold on better terms. With more room, more proportion, more lucidity, and more peace. That is how the long manuscript of the self continues when automatic slavery is no longer writing every line. The end of this path is not a dramatic climax, because real freedom rarely arrives with fireworks. It arrives as a quieter reliability, a way of living that no longer needs to fight every moment for meaning. The person stops treating each disturbance as a referendum on their worth. They stop treating every feeling as an order. They stop mistaking inner noise for inner truth. What remains is a steadier relationship to reality, and that steadiness is the real achievement. There is a dignity in reaching this point because the person is no longer confused about the source of suffering. Not all pain disappears, but its extra layers begin to fall away. The mind no longer insists on multiplying what is already difficult. It no longer feeds every irritation with interpretation. It no longer gives every old wound the authority of prophecy. This does not make life painless. It makes life less distorted, and distortion is often the larger enemy. A clear pain can be met. A distorted pain becomes endless. A real loss can be mourned. A loss turned into identity becomes a prison. The person who has walked far enough down this path learns to tell the difference. That is why the work matters. It does not remove the human condition, it removes some of the unnecessary suffering that clings to it. What makes this possible is not force in the usual sense. It is repeated fidelity to the pause, repeated honesty in the face of reaction, repeated willingness to remain present when the body wants to flee into habit. Over time, these small choices become an inner architecture. The architecture is what carries the person when mood changes, when pressure rises, and when old reflexes attempt to return. In that sense, the end is also a foundation. The person is no longer merely surviving their mind. They are inhabiting it with more skill. That skill changes everything else. Once the mind is inhabited with more skill, the person begins to experience responsibility differently. Responsibility is no longer only obligation, and it is no longer a burden imposed from the outside. It becomes the simple recognition that one's inner state has consequences. What is repeated becomes character. What is indulged becomes habit. What is observed becomes workable. What is ignored continues to govern from below. This makes the smallest decisions matter more, not less. How quickly to answer, whether to speak from hurt or from clarity, whether to feed resentment or let it pass, whether to protect dignity or perform injury, whether to stay present or retreat into automatic story. These are the places where the life is actually built, not in grand declarations, but in the repeated quality of attention. At this level, responsibility is deeply freeing because it returns power to the person without turning power into pressure. If the self can be shaped, then the self is not doomed. If the pattern can be seen, then the pattern can be softened. If the impulse can be paused, then the impulse is not the final authority. This is where hope becomes practical. It is no longer a vague wish that life will improve. It is the concrete knowledge that the next choice still matters. And yet the work remains gentle. Harshness does not create lasting freedom. It only adds another layer of struggle. The person learns to hold responsibility without contempt, to correct without humiliating, and to continue without drama. This is a more mature form of discipline because it is sustainable. It does not rely on fear to remain active. The more that becomes true, the less the old slavery can feed on self-accusation. And when self-accusation weakens, clarity has room to breathe. Clarity breathing freely changes the tone of the entire inner life. The person no longer lives in a dense atmosphere of overreaction and self-justification. There is more space between event and interpretation, more space between feeling and obedience, more space between memory and conclusion. That space is not emptiness in a barren sense. It is possibility. It is the place where a wiser response can emerge. This is especially important because many people confuse emotional intensity with depth, but depth without clarity quickly becomes confusion. Intensity alone can make everything feel significant while actually obscuring what matters most. The disciplined mind begins to see that quiet understanding is often more valuable than loud reaction. Understanding stays useful after the feeling has passed. The person who lives in this clarity is also harder to manipulate. Not because they have become suspicious of everyone, but because they are less vulnerable to inner coercion. They do not require every other person to validate their value. They do not need to dramatize every boundary. They do not need to turn every disagreement into a wound. Their center is less dependent on external weather, and so external weather matters less than it once did. This is one of the deepest forms of peace. It does not come from controlling the world. It comes from no longer being controlled by every ripple in it. The person remains human, of course. They still care, still feel, still respond. But the response is less automatic and more chosen. That is what makes it free. And when response becomes chosen often enough, the person begins to live from a quieter kind of authority. Not authority over others, but authority over the self. That is the final seriousness of the path. Authority over the self is not domination. It is the ability to remain internally oriented when the world tries to pull the mind apart. The person can hear conflict without becoming conflict. They can receive criticism without becoming self-hatred. They can encounter praise without becoming vanity. They can face uncertainty without collapsing into frenzy. This does not happen by accident. It happens because the mind has been trained to recognize what is appearing without immediately mistaking it for command. The strange beauty of this authority is that it often looks very unremarkable from the outside. The person is simply calmer, clearer, and less performative. But inside, a major transformation has occurred. The old habit of surrendering the center at the first sign of discomfort has weakened. The self is no longer so easily leased out to reaction. This quiet ownership is what makes everything else more stable. There is also room for honest love in such a life. When the self is not constantly in emergency mode, love no longer has to function as rescue. It can be given more cleanly and received more calmly. People can be met as they are rather than as instruments of emotional repair. This makes relationships less needy and more real. It also makes disappointment easier to bear, because love is no longer being used to promise immunity from pain. That is an important freedom. The person no longer asks relationship to abolish impermanence. They allow relationship to be impermanent and still meaningful. They allow care to be vulnerable and still worthwhile. They allow connection to be deep without pretending it is exempt from change. This realism is not cold, it is mature. And maturity, in the end, is what makes freedom durable. It keeps the heart open without making the mind naive. It keeps the self responsible without making it harsh. It keeps life human while making it less captive.